All right, hello again, World Language Clan. This is Devin at Libre, and this is part two of the case for change, what research reveals needs to change in world language classrooms. So here we're at part two, we're looking at the orders of acquisition studies and what this is going to mean for world language teachers and is what is going to indicate needs to change. So the orders of acquisition was this series of studies that happened in the 70s and the 80s, and there's a lot of research to back it up. But here are some of the implications behind these as well as the definition. L2 learners in general acquire certain morphological features. Now, back up for a second. Morphemes being the smallest pieces of language that has meaning, such as ing or ed or something like the word cook, acquire certain morphological features in a fixed and predictable order over time, with, of course, slight individual differences. So that's the research definition. What does this mean? It means that anybody who is learning an L2 learners across all languages, they're going to use similar processes to organize and process new language. This also means that somebody learning their first language as a native speaker is going to learn the same things in the same sequence. So, what that must mean, of course, is that our brain is structured and organized to learn language. Now, if that's true, why is it so difficult for some people to learn language and so easy for others? That is a huge question in second language acquisition research that we are still working towards getting the answer to. But there are definitely some things kind of rustling around in the bushes with this idea here as we look at it more deeply. So let's keep going with language acquisition, which acts independently of the order or frequency in which language is presented to the learner. In other words, despite the wide variation in parent speech for L1, anybody learning their first language as a native speaker, young kids, and in curriculums for L2, anybody learning English picks up similar features in a similar time frame. So those of you who have kids, or if you work with really little kids, you'll know what I'm talking about. Look at this list of the English orders of acquisition. The first thing that native speakers of English learn, as well as L2 learners, is first they pick up ing, going, eating, sleeping. Number two, the second thing that they're going to learn after that and master is the regular past tense. The third is irregular past tense. Watch this one. This one's a crazy one. Number four is third person present tense, which means that your brain does not go from simplest language form to most difficult in a logical sequence as we might see it and as often is presented in our curriculum. No, it's quite the opposite. The highest frequency is first. And there's also, I've read some research recently for a class that has to do with the degree of saliency. And saliency means that how much can somebody unfamiliar with the language pick out a certain sound? That's saliency. Like if I say the word going, the ing is very strong. It's got a lot of inflection, it's got a lot of saliency. Whereas something like got a lot of, those words all kind of clump together in the middle of a sentence. So it's hard for learners to pick up on the individual pieces in that sentence. Whereas ing, that usually sticks out. High degree of saliency. Regular past tense is also very frequent, very important to the meaning of the sentence. And learners pick up that pattern relatively quickly. Also in English, there's not a ton of variation with regular past tense, but there's a ton of variation with irregular past tense. So that usually comes later. But here's the mysterious part. The last thing that they learn is present tense. And what I mean by learn is the last thing that they're familiar with, the last thing that they can use is third person present tense. That's the S on the end of words when you're talking about who's doing what. So toddlers very quickly pick up I go, you go, But for a while, they'll say he, she, go. It takes a long time for them to learn he or she goes. That's the third person present tense. So we talked a little bit about morphemes in here, and let's just check and make sure that we're all here on the same page, because I don't know about you, but it's been a hot minute since my last linguistic course. But these are morphemes. They're wonderful. They are the smallest unit of language that carries meaning. And you can think of them like the building blocks. They're like all the cool little Legos. You've got a couple different classes. You've got free morphemes and bound morphemes. Bound morphemes basically means it cannot exist without a word. Free morphemes, they're free, flying in the wind. They need no one. They need nothing and no one. So you have lexical morphemes, which are cook, stove, and they're content words. They mean stuff. And then you have functional morphemes, grammar words. They don't really mean stuff, but they're essential to creating time and reference. So you've got will, in, that kind of thing. Your bound morphemes are lonely. They need friends. They're derivational, which means that they're word creators. So you creators, actually, you can use that with derivational morphemes. Anything that's a suffix, that's a derivational morpheme. But things that change verbs to nouns and nouns to verbs and then back again is derivational. Inflectional morphemes are language teachers' favorites. These are all of your conjugation forms. These are everything that has to do with form changers. S, third person in English, and then of course third person in other languages. And then you got ED for the past, inflectional. You're going to need this definition for what we're about to look at next. So make sure you keep it in your head. Just remember, they're the sweet little Legos that make our beautiful language when you put them all together. So here are some ideas on the order of acquisition. The term order of acquisition generally refers to the order in which different structures of the target language are mastered to criterion level. So in English, you're going to have present progressive, past tense, and plural S on nouns. That's a big one. This one is for my Spanish-speaking friends. We've got el orden de adquisición no está determinado por sonidos aislados, sino por medio de la adquisición de oposiciones de rasgos pertinentes. The morpheme studies. So here, we're going to take a look at a specific set of studies that happened, the ones I referred to earlier in the 70s, starting with Brown, and then going to the 80s and 90s. These were comparisons of morpheme acquisition order between various L1s, ages, and backgrounds with L2 English. So they basically took a bunch of people who had all these different L1s, Arabic, Chinese, Russian, Spanish, you name it. And they were all these sweet little young kids learning English as well as their L1. And these studies are the basis for the theory of the order of acquisition. It continues to grow in depth and evidence, but there's enough there that we can reasonably assume it to be true, and it needs some refinement. So here's some of the implications of the findings. If there is a reasonably acceptable trend for English learners, then there has to be for every language. English is not special, people. Scholars associated with this studies, you got all these wonderful people right here, and it's a foundational belief in second language acquisition. Although it is critiqued and there's still more work that needs to be done, it's pretty well established as something that definitely hints towards a higher order of acquisition. And here is somebody who also thinks that. One of the most established findings in the field concerns the more or less fixed order in which learners acquire the morphosyntactic structure of their L2. Remember that word? Morphosyntactic being morphemes and syntax. This is what Larson Freeman has to say about it in the good old 90s. Contrary to what some critics have alleged, there are too many studies conducted with sufficient methodological rigor, nailed it, methodological rigor, and showing sufficiently consistent general findings for the commonalities to be ignored. Yes, language teacher. I can talk. Yes. Here's a specific study that I want to look at. Now, of course, remember, this is one study done by Morales and Smith in 2013, but it has some pretty powerful implications to it. So let's take a look. According to this study, this is what Spanish learners usually master first. Now, I wanted to highlight this here, of course, because in my department, and maybe you either as a solo Spanish teacher in your department, this is one of the #1 languages learned in the US right now. So this is something that people really are interested in studying because we have a lot of Spanish speakers, all that good junk. So I put in here an example of what Spanish learners, how that might connect to their order of acquisition. This is what the four morpheme model finds. The first thing that Spanish learners master first is content-rich words, nouns, adjectives, verbs, the words that tell them what's going on and how people feel about them. The next thing is gender agreement, which is understandable because it is something that comes up a lot in Spanish with articles and nouns, especially gender patterns like A endings. Very obvious, right? What they found in their specific study is that what tends to need time and exposure are things like que as a connector or a bridge between ideas. This is something called a bridge morpheme. Also, what needs time and exposure is past tense, not on its own, but when given with a clue such as ayer, meaning yesterday. So past tense morpheme markers without clues, that takes even more time. If you just want to say, ya me fui, like, yeah, I already left, people are going to need more time and exposure for that because you didn't say something like 5 minutes ago. Also, the identification of infinitives marked by the ending R. Interesting, right? Because that used to be one of the first things that I would present to my class. This is the holy grail here. What advanced low level still struggles with, and this is according to ACTFL OPIs. In this study, what they did is they took a couple people who were rated advanced low in Spanish and they conducted an OPI style interview. And these are some of the things that they tracked their errors on. And here are some things that they found. Ooh, get a load of this. Número uno, we've got ser versus estar. This is considered a late system bridge morpheme, meaning that, yeah, those words contain a lot of meaning, but being able to tell the difference between them takes a lot of time and effort and exposure, and it's something that advanced low speakers still struggle with. How about this one? Gender agreement in non-content settings, meaning merely for agreement's sake, such as noun, adjective, that kind of thing, because it carries very little semantic weight, meaning that it doesn't give a listener any more idea of what's going on in the sentence. It just makes sure that it's accurate. Then 3, you have person, number, tense, and aspect morphology on verbs. Crazy, right? Because that's something that we test for. 4, we've got verb endings that indicate differences between third person singular and plural. So this is a very, very specific error where people will sometimes say es instead of son, singular and plural. They still know what it means, but sometimes they mix them up. 5, you've got different complex mood endings, such as subjunctive. 6, number agreements that do not carry semantic weight, meaning things like putting your S's wherever they belong, like calcetines rojos. Does any of that make you think? I hope it does. Now, here's a specific quote from this study to kind of dive a little bit further into these ideas. We've got teachers and learners should understand the challenges presented by gender and number on nouns and articles and bridge morphemes in Spanish at beginning levels. Remember, morphemes being our cute little Legos, Lego blocks of language. And the continuing challenges presented by gender and number on adjectives and verb endings as students progress to more advanced levels. This is a big thing for Romance language teachers, is that idea of gender agreement. And it's maybe something that we should ease up on a little bit. The acquisition of Spanish morphosyntactic development is another study that looked at gender errors in all levels of L2 learners of Spanish. And this specific study found that they persist very long into L2 acquisition. There are different types, and people do different things at different times in their language acquisition progression. But after the initial L1 influence kind of starts to peter away a little bit, errors are finally overcome at advanced stages of acquisition, meaning that it takes time to be good at. I hope in your head that you're thinking of some implications for practice and curriculum for you, because that reading that study is something that definitely made me take a second look at the way that I teach gender and number. There are numerous studies confirming the lengthy nature of gender agreement for L2 learners of Spanish. I just cited 2 here, but there's a way more, baby. You better believe it. World language classroom curriculum, expectations, and assessment, they should align with the established and research-based orders of acquisition. So think back to what we talked about with learning English as either an L1 or an L2. If every brain learns the same features of language in relatively the same order, not at the same time. Remember, there are individual differences, but not at the same time, but certainly in a predictable pattern and order. Why are we trying to swim upstream, y'all? Maybe we should follow that order. That's an important thing for ESL teachers. And also, that order is something that we need to really, really nail down in other languages, put more research towards that, and we should also be following that pattern. There does exist research out there, definitely a lot for Spanish. There's a little bit on French. There's more being done every day. And I'm not sure, I can't speak directly to other languages, but I know that with Spanish and French, that there is a lot hinting at a definite order. And we should be using that to guide what we teach and when. So let's look at some curriculum implications. You can kind of see a nice little preview of what we're going to jump into in a second. But this has been part 2, looking at the orders of acquisition and morphemes and the 4 morpheme studies. And in part 3, we're going to take a look at what this is going to mean for our people. The most important ones to all this research, right? Our students.